reflecting now on session 4 of the Mountain Witch, as we clearly have moved into what in game terms is Act 3, and in chapter terms, because chapters either match the acts or there's more than one chapter in an act, moving into a new chapter, more or less by default. And so who knows if we're going to stay in Act 3 and just have another chapter or so in it, or move into Act 4 and then have one or more chapters in it. That's, structurally, we sort of discover that as we go. But that brings us, in my mind, Act 3 is, for our game, is related to the crest of Mount Fuji and being within sight of the Mountain Witch's fortress. What defines the acts in the rules is a little bit flexible. He suggests that Act 3 is actually in the fortress and Act 4 is confronting the witch, but it's really, find out as you go. The point is merely to not get stuck on any one of these locations and, screw around on the side of the mountain forever and suddenly realize that you've been playing for way too long and whatever. Just keep moving up the mountain, basically. The reflections include some whimsical stuff because there are plenty of mythological creatures from Japanese culture that I would love to include, but the game is not an encyclopedia of encountering each of these creatures from A to Z, so I reluctantly have to put a number aside. Some of them are not really suited for the location. A lot of them involve households and a community like a village or even a city, and so they don't really fit, in the magically blighted Mount Fuji of the game. But some of them are just too cool, and I sadly, reluctantly admit that I cannot properly use the piglet ghost that sucks people's souls out, or the childlike demonic spirit or entity that lurks around households and licks up all the nasty scum in bathrooms and stuff like that and spreads disease. Or even better, the household items that just sort of take on lives of their own, sort of ghostly-ish, or they kind of become ghost versions of themselves, or even though they remain being actual objects and they have opinions. Sometimes they are not malicious, but sometimes, they dislike their owners and torment them. One either version of this or variant upon it is an umbrella that has one leg and one eye and causes all sorts of trouble and hops around. So, these are just charming. You got to love these. Now, one in particular, and I toyed with it, but, including it, but it certainly would have been further down, lower on the mountain, and we were pretty stuffed with stuff at that point in play, and I just realized it was a huge diversion to, just showcase cool critters if I did it. But one of these days, in playing the Mountain Witch or in any setting that permits this, I'm definitely going to include the tanuki, which is based on what is popularly called the raccoon dog, which is actually kind of fox in that part of Asia. Pretty widespread. Japan is only part of its range, and it is a small canid, smallish canid with markings on its face that are analogous to those found in the American raccoon. But anyway, it's an ordinary animal, but in Japanese mythology you have these humanoid, anthropomorphic versions of them. They look like people, but they have the heads of these particular sorts of creatures. And they run around doing like human things, like so many creatures in mythology do. They have boats or villages, or, conduct tasks and stuff like that, sort of fairy tale versions of the creatures. Um, with the interesting detail of having these big bulging testicles in great big scrotums, and the skin of the scrotum is in these creatures in mythology, they can basically stretch it and it becomes this remarkable, can do anything thing, like sails for your boat, or, you kind of spin it around and stretch it so you get this rope that can be pulled, and the stories just go on from there. I mean, you get all these crazy, amusing notions of these creatures basically using the skin of their scrotums for, tools and structures and all kinds of things. So the whimsicality of it all is irresistible, and as well as the amusing grotesquerie. And so you can bet, one of these days, the whatever players I'm with, or if I'm playing in a game where you get to introduce stuff like that, the tanuki and their interesting attributes will appear. Okay, on to more serious topics. As usual, I have to wait on this because I can't give stuff away, in the middle of it all. So you're seeing this after the fact. I really am happy with exactly what has happened in terms of the tensions among the Ronin finally, hitting their breaking points. The interesting rules aspect here is that I keep reminding and urging the players to, GM the joint with Dark Fate stuff. I would love for someone to bring in, a creature or a character from their own backstory and say, this guy shows up and is talking to me. Or, a creature from the Mountain Witch's fortress, flaps down and tells me something. And what is it? This is what they tell me. And I'm more or less convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the players' habits, particularly the people with role-playing backgrounds, their habits are such that they just don't intuitively do that. They just do not, basically reach into their GM bag and do it during play in a game where they perceive another person as the game master. And although they have, in the phase of my urging, you'll see a couple of times when during the Dark Fate moment, the designated moment of do something with your Dark Fate, that's your job now. One player even asks me, can I take the liberty of doing this? And I'm thinking to myself, you should be doing that liberty all the time at this point in play. But it's, a bit of a learning curve, and it is also fine. I mean, the extent to which they do it is voluntary outside of those scenes. The question is whether it's involuntary or voluntary based on habit at this point. Well, that's okay. The fact is that we do see two of them, the ones with the more emotional and sort of soap opera backstories, have clearly, kicked it into high gear. They both have had on a fairly strong burn from the beginning, and it's been only inevitable. Helma has taken the step of saying that, well, my Dark Fate is if he, stood up his fiance and has obviously is now, has been desperately in love with this other woman, and I'm sworn to vengeance, to kill this guy. Well, I'm the fiance, right? He never met me, and I have gone on the warpath about this. And it's been wonderful to watch Helma play in such a sense of really the character has been deciding whether Ola's character deserves lethal vengeance, and has actually tried to connect with him more than once to see whether it was all a misunderstanding or whether there's something to be salvaged from this, or whether basically, vengeance is the path she wants to take after all. And coming to the conclusion that, yes, it is, and facing the fact that she's been terribly wounded and is, saddled with all these penalties, it's now or never, basically. And the dice could have gone differently. And so the effects and what was chosen to do and all that stuff, during play, you've hopefully seen it by now before seeing this, is just glorious. I mean, the Mountain Witch is built for this kind of thing to happen. The tools are there, the materials, the content is there for events like this to occur. And that is what the game is for. You'll note that the other two have not really brought in substantive backstory content. We've got great imagery for what sort of threatens Max's character in terms of that owl, but not so much in terms of exactly what he did or what he fears will be known. And Nathan has remained, pretty much silent about the nature of any pact with the witch. And I can kind of see Nathan's point in this, because once you kind of cop to, well, I have a pact with the Mountain Witch, it's kind of a guaranteed breakdown among the group, depending on the details. But it would be nice to have intimations of the character's backstory and priorities that, have led to it. And he kind of picked up on the whole Hara clan thing as being involved, but we really don't know why or what sort of content is there as far as the character is concerned. And so in the absence of any of that, and having reviewed the GMing instructions and how Act 3, there is a great deal of obligation on the GM to really utilize what they do know and can use. And the fact that there's a Dark Pact at all, well, it is available to me, and I don't want to bring in content for it, but I can definitely be much more blunt by this act in, talking to the player and putting stuff into play that almost give it away. And so I did. And the way I did it, you'll have to look at it. But I did not want to take over content for it. I didn't want to either flat out say, hey, I'm a messenger from the witch, and how about that pact? Nor did I want to come up with more details about what the character had decided or done in the past on my own. I'm not supposed to do that. But you'll see from, in the session, or you have seen in the session, what I did choose to do that basically brought more of this out into the open so that we know that something is up or going on with this guy. So the ending, I think, was of that session. The closing, I should say, of that session seemed to flow somewhat from that as well, in terms of what Nathan chose to do. I really have a hard time getting across to people that the Ronin don't have to go and confront the witch. They can turn around and leave and say, we're not going to get what we want. They could become bosom buddies and say, we are going to be, best buds forever, on the basis of this adventure together. Those are independent as well. I mean, they could bands together and, put aside their dark fates. The guy with the Dark Pact can say, screw the witch. I don't want that after all. I'm going to trust my buds instead. And we're going to go and take this witch down. Or who knows, the Dark Pact one could say, hello, Mountain Witch, I brought your victims here, or whatever it is that the pact is about. All of those are viable, and they're independent of one another. They could destroy one another, break up, and give up on the mission and all leave and go their separate ways, or they could team up and trust each other and, totally say we are all about, the one group, and not go after the witch after all, because they decide maybe to choose one of the other's priorities uh, as their priority and more important than the witch. And look, we do this, we'll help you. We care about your problems more than anything else after all. And then the story's over as they leave the mountain. All of those are valuable, and I was speaking as the group as a whole in each of those cases, but obviously, per subgroup or pairing or whatever of the player characters is viable as well. One could go on and confront the witch alone, for example. It's all cool. It's all good as we see those decisions and the revelations about the backstory and the decisions about them play out is what the game is about. The notion that, well, we have to go through these acts and we have to go confront the witch and we have to go, that's flat out. That's not what they're for. Oh, let's see. I say again, damage is everything. And this game is deeply not wushu, where you get to roll, and then if you get a high roll, you get to say what happens, and you get to bring in the coolness of the narration, and not at all. This is Damage in the Mountain Witch is blood and bone. I mean, you might take flesh wounds once in a while, which only last for the next roll. That's fine, but everything else is, blood on the snow and broken limbs and, painful forcing oneself forward. And I think the players have realized, wow, we're going to be carrying these wounds. I mean, a full chapter. I mean, Ron's kind of wicked about these chapters. We can encounter more than one thing, which I think is also important. A chapter should not be, or rarely should be, a single encounter. You need to feel those chapter wounds moving from one, encounter into the next. So that's why another reason why multiple sessions is a really good idea. You need room to feel the length of a chapter and the wounds carry over into the next chapter and not just clear per encounter, except for permanent wounds. That's losing the nuances of the wounds, and it's losing the pressure that you're up against and saying, wow, until the end of the chapter, I'm carrying 3 or 4 penalties. That's brutal. Yeah, it is. You'll only have maybe 1 permanent wound, say, hypothetically, moving into the next chapter. But right now, you are suffering. Your roll per d6 is -4. So with all of this going on, one needs to understand, the dice. The player only ever rolls a single die. And whether it adds to someone else's die or whether it is take the best of the two regarding another die, or if multiple people do that, the best of however many, that's up to your actions in the game and also about spending, trust points. And I really think that before anybody plays this game for the first time, they really need to sit down and run some sort of practices, maybe with someone else who's going to play, and realize just what these dice do. It's really not like any other game. And the fact that, even after a kick-ass encounter where some creature gets waxed, one or more characters may, be like, I got hurt. This is, my next roll is going to be penalized, or I'm going to be penalized for the rest of the chapter and maybe penalized throughout the game. From now on, it's kind of fun. I mean, for the first chapter, somebody's taking like a permanent wound and you're like, yeah, just basically that you carry that. Well, how do I heal? You don't. I think that's actually a serious aspect of playing this game. All right. Well, that will do it, I think. And I look forward to all the more.